Today's workshop is Policing in the Time of Pandemic, Police Operations and Crises, and this morning's presenter is Roger Gomm. I just want to do a tiny bit of housekeeping around questions. There is an opportunity during Roger's presentation for a natural opportunity for questions and answers and a bit of discussion. And the best way to manage that is in your dashboard on the side of your screen, you should have a small icon for a yellow hand. If you put your yellow hand up, I just tap the yellow hand icon, we'll be able to see that you want to ask a question, and then we can invite you to speak. And that way it'll just mean that people don't over talk across one another, and we can hear everybody clearly. Also in the chat down at the right hand side, please, all comments, any questions, any other questions or points to raise, just pop them in there. We will be monitoring that and we can raise that as well. And anything that doesn't get covered today, we can pass to Roger to pick up at the beginning of the next session on Wednesday. So hopefully everything and every question will get covered one way or another. Okay, just to let you know, the web workshop is being recorded and we can make that available to you at the end of the 3 sessions. Lovely. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Roger to start his presentation. Thank you very much.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, good afternoon, good day, wherever you are in the world. I hope that means you can all hear me. I'll just get my presentation full size on the screen. As Karen has said there, Roger Gomm, I'm going to talk to you primarily about crisis management, but it is in perspective to the wider COVID response. I'm going to use the 3 workshops to sort of build up, and I'll explain that in a second. This is what Karen has just said. So, you know, it's the maintaining operational efficiency under the stress of external changes, which I think has been a challenge in many countries, including the UK. So that's what I'm aiming to do, but I'm just going to unpick it slightly so we're all on the same sort of playing field, if you like. So I'm just going to describe the different types of terms, and I'm just going to stick to some key ones, as you'll find in a minute, and then talk through the classic crisis management processes or incident management processes, which some of you I hope will recognise. Then on the next workshop, I'll take you through gold, silver and bronze, or strategic, tactical and operational. Then we'll look at the tools. This is where it starts to get interesting, I think. We'll look at the tools available to incident commanders to understand what they're dealing with. And then there is a little bit of homework there. I'm hoping that you'll take the tool away, and then we can have the final session. We can look at the wider impacts and consequences of COVID-19 and try and build up our own picture. So that's hopefully you're going to join me Wednesday and Friday this week for the follow-up. There they are. As you see in bold there, a little bit of homework each day. Probably the one you'll enjoy the most is the Wednesday evening, or sorry, Wednesday after session 4 there, to allow us to have a bit of an interactive session on Friday. I can't see any questions coming up. I'm just going to very quickly talk about some of the health and safety. Wherever you are, normally if we were sitting in one room, I'd have a responsibility, but wherever you are, if you've got a problem, please deal with it. One of the things I'm not going to worry too much about the cameras on. Karen has managed that. But I'll just mention the language. One of the problems we all face, and it's wherever I go globally, is this language issue. And that's not, can you understand me in English? We often have English-speaking people failing to understand each other because we use abbreviations and acronyms. And I always emphasize to people, if you don't know what it means, you must ask, because you must understand. And actually, if you're speaking, try to avoid acronyms. There are, time and place for them. It can speed things up. Karen has mentioned the chat questions. Please feel free. I'd like to have a bit of an interactive session at the end. It would be useful at the end of each session. And then really, my background, I'm not going to read all that out, but I was a police officer in London for 34 years, and the last 13 or 14 years of those were in the Metropolitan Police Public Order Branch, where I had the, I'm going to say, pleasure. That's probably why, if you can see me, I've got grey hair, but pleasure to manage and command and help other people manage events across London and at times in other parts of the country. You can look at that at your leisure. I don't really want to spend time talking about myself. Right, so I will start off by talking about the different types of incidents. Now, I've tried to take a global picture here. I spend a bit of time for the Cabinet Office Emergency Planning College going around the UK and to a number of countries around the world. Although there are some differences, there's a lot of similarities, and it's the similarities, so we're all talking the same language, I think is really rather important. So I'm going to start with quite a basic incident comparison. Standard incidents, perhaps you're, as you've got there, a fire alarm, could be a security door found insecure. These are the incidents that we deal with regularly, and we know what to do. We've perhaps got standard operating procedures to help us manage them. Then the next term there, routine emergency. I think the picture probably tells you a traffic collision, not serious. Police, perhaps ambulance, maybe fire service attend. They're routine. We're into a bit of we're used to managing this sort of thing. Certainly from a UK perspective, there is the ability of the public to deal with it themselves. So they're sort of quite routine. Then we step up to the picture there, as you can see, from the 7th of July terrorist attacks, a major incident. Risk to life, quite difficult, but we've got a plan. That's the key to it. We've got a plan. And certainly in the second session, we'll be making sure we got the plans for the things we should be expecting. Then the crisis. Is COVID-19 a crisis? There's a number of issues around the world. If what constitutes a crisis? Do we really understand? I'll give you a definition of it and a bit more of an explanation. And then we will look at what the academics have to say. So just to sort of emphasize these four as a sort of a starter: standard incident, low impact. It's generally a known response. People know what to do. And this is really multi-agency, not just policing wise. You could include the security company. You could include the owners and occupiers of premises. It's a standard incident. There's a known response. As it says there, standard operating procedures. They don't tend to last for very long. The next one there, again, there's a few key words there: routine emergency, significant impacts, quite localized, could be controlled by just one organization. It could be controlled by the organization that's got the problem, i.e. perhaps a power failure. You imagine how that would affect your business. Well-defined response, may even use their major incident plans. Like MI there, there's me saying, no abbreviations, and I've got one there. So that's MI, major incident plan. Quite often this is covered by most organizations with their business continuity arrangements, how to maintain their critical functions. So that's the first two. And we step up, as I said there, to major incident, risk to life. It could have impacts on the environment. it tends to be multi-agency. And the abbreviation there is because it's rather long, the Joint Emergency Services Interoperability Programme, which is a UK programme, very much operational tactical, pulls together all agencies to operate using the same processes and procedures. And it's quite well embedded now across the UK. You sometimes need innovative solutions. You need some thinking about how we can respond to and recover from these incidents. And you quite often have some longer term impacts. Some examples there, you could look at the large fires. Certainly in the UK, we've had a number of events. It's sort of terrorist attacks. It could be Buncefield fire. That was another good example. Big standard set piece incidents. Then you get into your crisis, and I'll take you through a definition that might help to sort of unpick this. So no end solution you can see down the bottom there. Could be the destruction of infrastructure. Quite often where it says transcends plans or procedures, perhaps the plan has failed, or God forbid, we didn't have a plan. There's not necessarily an end solution or an end position, and the scale and the duration is significant. So that's really designed just to get you thinking. I will put up a few definitions. The BS is the British Standards Institute. So for an incident, an adverse event that might cause disruption, loss, or an emergency, but which does not meet the organisation's criteria for or definition of a crisis. Not sure that helps very much, but it is a definition is out there. Just remember that's very much that local impact, standard operating procedures as far as I'm concerned with that type of incident. This one is quite important. This is a UK definition of a major incident. If you can read the top line there, an eventual situation with a range of serious consequences, which requires special arrangements to be implemented by one or more emergency responders. This was a relatively, it's an updated definition. Then it made a number of significant changes in the UK. And if you look at point A there, underneath, it talks about emergency responder agencies. And it talks about all category 1 and 2 responders in the Civil Contingencies Act. So it's not just police, fire and ambulance, local authorities, it is everybody involved in this environment. So it's the water companies, it's the transport companies, it's the gas company, it's the electricity, it's the communications, everybody who may be involved in an incident, in a major incident. And the reason this term is there is to encourage all agencies to adopt this term. And the term really is quite easy if we keep to its the core area. So beyond the scope of business as usual operations, and that's for the individual agencies. So this beyond the scope of business as usual is when you have to stop doing one thing in order to respond to something else, take resources away from their normal activity. But it goes on to talk about serious harm, damage, risk to life is the one that I would always emphasize. If there's a risk to life, that's quite it, that pushes us towards this definition. Just spot there, it says essential services, the environment or national security. I'll come back to that in a second. And there at C, maybe a single agency, but invariably a major incident requires a multi-agency response. And the bits in bold really are the ones that I find really important just to understand this definition. Beyond the scope of business as usual for individual organisations, and then the multi-agency response. I would probably say if there's a risk to life, that's probably why it's the multi-agency response there. But at this stage, I'll just throw you a question. Does this fit a cyber attack? If you imagine an organisation, not necessarily the police service, perhaps a local authority, cyber attack on their servers, shuts it down. Is that an essential services? Does it have a risk to life or welfare? Is there I think you can see the answer should be, yes, it does. Now, in the UK, there's been a big drive to adopt this term for a cyber attack. So, you know, if in terms of a cyber attack, you haven't necessarily got that immediate risk to life that we would see from perhaps a terrorist attack, but it fits this definition. And it's quite important that people, you know, start to think, what are we going to call it? Because I'm a great believer in having common language for all these types of incidents. Then we can all understand each other. I won't worry about D&E on the bottom, but do have a look at that at your leisure. Spend a little bit of time just looking at this definition: abnormal or unstable situation that threatens an organization's strategic objectives, reputation, or viability. Now, if you just think in terms of an organization, we should all know what their strategic objectives are. If you are in business, you know, you want to make the best widget possible at a competitive price and make a profit. That's why you're in business normally. And why do people buy your widget? It's based on your reputation, it's reliability, it's all those things that build up. And really, your viability it's a bit of a circle. It's if you're selling well, you're getting money in, finance is flowing, but anything that interrupts that, even for a short period of time, could have an impact on your strategic objectives or your reputation or your viability, or more likely, all three. Now, I think if we look at governments throughout the world as an organization, their strategic objectives, if we try to keep it simple, are to provide a safe and secure environment for the population and business to thrive. I'm keeping it really simple, but I think you can understand that. A safe and secure environment for the, if you like, the residential and business community of the country, in order that they thrive, because when they're thriving, it increases revenue to Her Majesty's government or your government. And reputation is so important. Just, you may want to think about COVID, strategic objectives, safe and secure environment, reputation, viability. It's costing all governments around the world a significant amount of money. And we all know that we're going to have a depression. It's going to be difficult for the next 5 or 10 years. So I hope that sort of gives you an indication of what it is we're looking at. So quite an important term, not necessarily one used within the police service, but it is used by governments, local and national, and organisations globally. And I think it's language the police service should adopt. And obviously, crisis management is the organisation capacity, not just to respond, but to prevent it happening in the first place, to avert, respond to, and learn from a crisis. That learning is often the key to making sure we don't have a similar problem in the future. One definition that we have in the UK, and we've had around for a number of years, for all the right reasons, the critical incident term, which was as a result of a tragic event in South London, murder of Stephen Lawrence, and the police the investigation into the Metropolitan Police afterwards. That definition there, any incident where the effectiveness of the police response is likely to have a significant impact on the confidence of the victim, their family, and/or the community. Is that any different to this one? Is that not saying the same thing? I've had a number of problems brought to my attention locally with the police service using this definition and local authorities not really understanding what it means to them. Maybe a lack of interagency working, but any incident like that, any critical incident is going to, in this day and age, and it was in 1999, to require other agencies to support the police response. I'll leave that there for you to consider. It'd be interesting to see what you think of that. But I would just say to you that they're very similar, and the one that is used by governments, both national and local, and organisations throughout the world is this crisis term. Interested to know what you think. Okay, so having listened to me going on about those incidents, I'm just going to go back two slides. No, I'm not going to go back 2 slides. Before I move on to the academics and what they think, I would just add that the UK also has, as is common in a lot of countries, some specific legislation that provides, if you like, under the Civil Contingencies Act in the UK, we have the term emergency, definitely with capital E. And these are national events, or they could be regional events, but it tends to be national events. So we have a emergency legislation that covers just about everything. Just about everything. Interestingly, for COVID, they didn't use it. Someone may like to explain to me what they think about that. Why didn't they use the legislation? And I know that's very common in a lot of countries, that you've got legislation available to governments to dictate the strategy across the whole country. And it has to be something quite significant. So really, you know, I'm just going to pause there if there's any sort of reflection on any of these. If I just go back to the major incident definition, you may like to consider, is that a critical incident? Could well be, but you know, it's not the thinking for me is it's not an incident, not a definition of an incident that other agencies recognize, which is why I personally feel that this definition is not helpful to other agencies. Just a personal view. Interesting to see what you think. But I will just cover what the academics think, because this often helps us. It often helps us. So you've got 3 terms there. Academics, Riddle and Weber, 1973, easily available on the internet if you type those in. Hierarchy events. They talk in terms of tame problems, loosely structured problems, and wicked problems. And I think the pictures probably say enough. So the tame problems, as you can see, there's a good example, just what we might call a routine incident. Significant delays on that motorway. Then a loosely structured, that's, you know, major incident territory, but we've got a plan. It might have been a bit difficult, but that's Buncefield fire. Significant, it's the biggest fire in the UK since the war. Then a wicked problem. That is a developed picture for a film, actually. Right, so let's just have a look at what they say about incidents. So a normal incident there, sorry, a tame problem is as we've said, a normal incident. normally understood, core skills, routine protocols, very much what we've said about our perhaps our first two. You know, it's that business as usual, standard operating procedure territory. So a tame problem. It's a win situation. We can normally resolve the situation and get back to normal relatively quickly. The consequences don't last for too long. Quite an interesting way of looking at it. The loosely structured. You need that multi-agency collaboration, very much in that major incident territory, as far as I can see. There's coordination issues. It's usually well practiced, structured. It's a recognized response. It says there that, well, they say win situation. If you just reflect on that picture, the wider impacts and consequences of the Buncefield fire were quite significant. Loss of aviation fuel to Heathrow Airport. I think it was about 25, 30%, no, 40% actually of the aviation fuel was pumped by pipeline to Heathrow Airport. And that's that cascading consequences, the bigger picture issues, the geographic spread. All right, we've got an incident, there it is, but just think in terms of that smoke. Where's it going? What could the impact be? Do we need to worry about it? Is it toxic? Yes, it is. So there's multiple problems within this, the loosely structured type of incident from the academics, and extended time and secondary issues. There is still, I believe, a lake of water at Buncefield, at the runoff, which is still there waiting to be dealt with. Secondary issues. Then finally, a wicked problem. I think the picture probably paints a picture. That's enough really, but multiple sensors, inability to respond, lack of information, rapidly degrading conditions. And if you think that you're managing this, you know, you've been put in a chair for something like this, just think of how you would feel. So at high time pressure for the response, inability to prioritize, and a no-win situation. If it's got to that stage. But just reflect on that picture. What's caused that? You know, there's a failure of planning there and a failure to recognize we have a problem. Personally, I'd like to think that's not a random event. We should know that's coming and therefore have evacuated the area, and there should be no risk issues there. Or am I just being hopeful? It says there, no win situation. So that's a lovely term, a wicked problem. And when you look at what they talk about there, I'm not going to go through each one of these. Please look in your own time. When you look closely at how they define a wicked problem, there's some lovely little lines there. No immediate and ultimate test of a solution. So it's not easy to work your solutions out. There's no true or false, good or bad. You know, whichever way you decide to go has implications and further consequences. And there's no easy way to stop. Every wicked problem is essentially unique. You'd like to think if we'd had a similar incident before, we've learnt from it, and therefore we've now got a plan. Remember that when we go through the second session today, and I'll show you the UK's risk register. We had a plan for your pandemic influenza. 5 years ago, it was a resourced plan. Had lots of PPE, personal protective equipment, and it was kept up to date. Yet when COVID-19 strikes, which is a similar, not the same, similar type of virus, we were unprepared. the last point is really important. The planner has no right to be wrong. Now, this is the last point that they make in their academic paper, and it's quite an easy read. The planner has no right to be wrong, because the planner is anticipating what might happen in the future, is planning ahead and trying to highlight these issues, or at least should be. We'll look at the risk assessment process quite quickly in the second session. But if you're doing your risk assessment process correctly and keep anticipating changes, see what's going on globally, you shouldn't be caught out. It shouldn't allow the wicked problem to develop. But often our planners are not listened to. They're not listened to. So one of the points I'll make in the session, I'll say it now just for effect, there's no such thing as a random event. Nothing in nature is random. It all happens. It's whether we can spot the signs and symptoms. And there is a slide on that a bit later. But do remember that the planner has no right to be wrong. So when we look at our standard incident and our crisis management, is it starting to develop a picture for us? So our standard incident management, routine risks, we've got our processes and procedures. The GESIP stuff would certainly from a UK perspective has straightened that up. It's given us a template to work from. That's the Joint Emergency Services Interoperability Programme. Lots of protocols and processes to ensure that all agencies across the field, that's all agencies, are using the same approach. It's usually quite clearly defined, reasonably well understood. The in brackets there doesn't impact on normal operations. Depends on the size of the incident, of course. If we're in major incident territory, yes, it will. Could be quite a small response. And you can usually see a clear end position. But our crisis management is, if you like, the opposite to that. It's not routine. It could be unique. No clearly defined solutions, no accepted response. And it goes on there. High level of confusion, pressure, loss of control. So just reflect on those definitions there. We've looked at the top two, which is the first one there is from the British Standards, the second one from our academic deep dive there, and two from the English Oxford Dictionary. A crisis, time of intense difficulty or danger, is an event that is going to lead to an unstable and dangerous situation affecting an individual, group, community, or whole society. I just saw something on the chat there about government and COVID. Yeah, absolutely. You're on the right lines. Government and COVID response. But should it be like that? Think about that in the second session. I'll take you through the risk assessment process. Is it a no-win situation? Certainly we can see some inability to prioritize, but you're absolutely right, COVID fits that material. Now, the reason I've just started off with this is to say that policing, is just one of many pieces of a jigsaw in this day and age. We must all work together, and that's all agencies. It says they're integrated. That means everybody, and they're, very rarely do we have an incident that is single agency that is going to challenge us. If anything that gets difficult, we need a whole range of agencies, and wherever you are in the world, I think you could add to this list. And therefore it's really useful to have a clear understanding of what incidents are and what the challenges are. Now, to a degree, we try to achieve this in the UK with our local partnerships, but there is a bit of a mismatch, I find, with language. There are challenges in some of the countries around the world with this term crisis, because it makes it sound like you're not in charge. But it actually, if you think about the academic work, that probably helps you to understand. So I'm just going to pause there. I think that sort of next question is there any questions? If anyone wants to raise their hand. Is there any sort of question? I just saw something come up on the chat there about a health emergency. My question there would be, why didn't they use the Civil Contingencies Act, which their law lords had written for them under the Civil Contingencies Act? Why didn't they use it? Because the wider impacts of this current crisis, if we want to call it a crisis, is beyond health. Health is absolutely #1 priority. Does anyone want to raise their hand and ask a question? I'm looking to my There's an interesting comment there from someone about the regulations for staff operationally. I think when we look at the wider impacts and consequences on Wednesday, the second session Wednesday, then the piece of work we'll do together on Friday, I think the health, safety and welfare of staff would be, right up there. And secondly, it was an additional burden on the police service. And so yes, that's quite right. Any questions? I just read what you wrote in there, Brian, about not being in charge. I think I might use the word direction. What's the direction? What's the plan? Do we have a plan going forward? Or in March, did we have a plan? And I think it's the confusion that they created themselves and not really being able to move forward. But has anyone actually got a question they'd like to speak, or do you want me to read them off of here? There's lots of statements being written about, there's one there about Trump and COVID. I'll leave you to read that. Karen, Daisy, is there any questions there?
Well, if there are any questions, lots of really interesting comment though, but no specific questions. So while we get used to people putting their hands up and what have you, might be worth.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
Is there any sort of what do you, those that you've worked with in the police service, what's your view about if you take a multi-agency view of the term critical incident and crisis? The crisis is a term understood by others, whereas the critical incident, for lots of different reasons, is not understood by other agencies.
No.
Someone's raised a hand there.
Hello.
I can hear you, if that's you saying hello.
sorry. I just wanted to highlight the incident of the Manchester Arena bombing. Mm-hmm. The aftermath of the lack of communication, coordination by the emergency services. To me, what you've just said was a major incident that led into basically a disaster, a crisis, I beg your pardon. It led on to it because of exactly what you said, the lack of communication, they're not talking to each other. Now, how can we avoid that happening again?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely. I've got a lot of sympathy with that view. There's a lot of. I'm going to talk in terms of situational awareness was the big. I mean, I've read the report afterwards. I've got an understanding of what happened. But when you think of in terms of understanding the situation, I was a police officer, and I have to be careful here because I put myself in the same position. The emergency services think in terms of response very heavily because it's the saving life bit, but actually it's the response to and recovery from. And actually, it's not just that initial response. It's thinking about the wider impacts and consequences because it is a multi-agency response. And for me, that's, I know there's a number of issues, but for me, it's at that level, if you like, quite high level, strategic even, where they need to get this understanding of the response to and recovery from early on. They've all suffered from a lack of training and exercising, which has an impact on the operational delivery. Not an easy one to answer, but I think I'm not sure whether I even heard the term critical incident mentioned in the. It was certainly a major incident, but I don't think. Well, I hope the police service didn't view it as a critical incident and deal with it internally. Can you add anything to that?
Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes, I can still hear you.
Oh, sorry,
yeah.
beg your pardon. Yes, all I was thinking was it is assumed responsibility. Now, we are inherently guilty of doing this all the time. Someone has got to say, yes, it's down to me, and I take it from here. It's unfortunately because of the agencies involved, who takes command? How can we go forward on that?
Well, when I talk, I think it's tomorrow's session, I'll talk about that strategic management. And unfortunately, the law in this country isn't about, it's about a consensus. It's about working together. So no one agency will say, this is my responsibility. They will take pieces of it, but it is about working together. I mean, this slide that I put up at the end, it sort of reflects the way we do business, not just in the UK, but across the piece. And really, it is that if you think in terms of strategically, these people agreeing on a course of action, then seeing it through, working together. The law in the UK is very much about consensus, working together. They won't necessarily deal with other people's business, but they will work alongside them to support them during that, which I suspect is the problem.
Yes, thank you.
Roger,
So unless go on, there's another question.
Just from the chat, how can practitioners influence government decision makers when they've clearly gone?
Yes, well, I'd probably that's a real challenge, especially at the moment, because if you put yourself in the position of, well, go back a couple of months. If you were the mayor of Manchester, and you're the, if you like, the local figurehead, and you haven't got access to the information, the statistics, the infection rates, and it's being dictated to you from central government, how would you feel? And again, that goes against everything I just said about the local response, which I think helped to make it more of a crisis. It had a significant impact on the reputation of Leicestershire, their strategic objectives, and really he was inept because he couldn't do anything. He wasn't being given the information. And that wicked problem issue probably sums up how we felt. So yeah, it's really difficult. So if you look in terms of crisis managers, you could probably start to develop a list of what we would expect from them, and listening, having advisors that understand would be a key one for me. I'll leave it there. We could go on. We could make a seminar out of some of that, which we'll cover later. Any other thoughts? I would propose a 5-minute comfort break. It is now 9:45, so at 9:50 I'll start the next session. So just a 5-minute comfort break. At 9:50 I'll start the second session. Is that okay? Okay, see you in 5 minutes.
Yeah, that's lovely. Thanks. Yeah.
Can you hear me, Karen?
Yes, yes, can hear you.
Okay, I'll do a countdown, 10, 9, 8.
Yeah, we've got timer. You've got 30 seconds.
Yeah. Well, it looks to me like people are still there, whether that's just they've left their machines on. So I'll start, I think. Is that okay with you, Karen, to start? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'll start the second session. I'm going to have a look at the one of the processes that I think is really important. Now, I've simplified it, if you like: risk assessment, risk controls, contingency planning. It is a simplified version, primarily just to sort of make the point of how important it is. But really, this is about, it doesn't matter how you do it or what terms you use, it's just to emphasize the importance of this process. And really, when I say emphasize the importance of this process, as it says at the top there, that's individual or single organizations, local, regional, national governments, and actually internationally, if you think in terms of the World Health Organization, United Nations, they all do this. Lots of variations, but if you like, the basic principles of what they're doing is the same. And I'd just like to spend the next 25 minutes just looking at that in the hope that it helps us to understand the environment which we're working in. And I've simplified it, as I've said, down to risk assess, risk controls, and contingency planning. And if you're a manager, senior, or just operational, an understanding of this helps you understand the environment you're working in, and actually helps you to think about what you might need to respond to. And really, just to sort of break those words down, the risk assess is about understanding the threats, or quite simply, what are the problems, whether it's locally or nationally? What are the problems that we could face? What are the problems? Risk controls, create a range of risk control protocols. What are we going to do about those problems should they arise? Also, a plan. Have we got a plan? Do we need a plan? And really, the last one there, contingency planning. If you like, when it does go wrong, what are we going to do? And are we prepared? Can we deal with what we've got to do? Who's going to deal with it? And that's really at the basic level, the importance of these three areas. And we just have a closer look at them, really. So when we talk in terms of risks, we've got, if you like, the language they use is what are the hazards and malicious threats. And perhaps the most important one for me is reasonable worst case. Not Armageddon, but reasonableness. What's reasonable to expect from this hazard or this threat? What's the reasonable worst case? And that often causes some challenges depending on your approach. But what we do, we sort of identify as part of our risk assessment process the significant events, and we look at the likelihood and the impacts, and that gives us a picture that we can look at of our risks, if you like, our risk assessment. And certainly, if you look at, from a UK perspective, malicious threats, that's our terrorism, if you like. Non-malicious, that's fires, crashes, extremes of weather, whether it's hot or cold. And actually, serious and organized crime, think in terms of cyber, fraud, people trafficking. And then what we try to do is to plot them on a graph. You'll notice, I'm sure, straight away that we have an unusually, an extra, if you like, red square at 2, 5, 2 on likelihood, 5 on the impact. This is a relatively new change in the UK, and I think you'll see what goes in there a bit later. But we plot it out. Certainly from a UK perspective, we would look at the plotting up our risks in the boxes rather than on the lines. But there's several different ways of highlighting this. Some people, times the impact by the likelihood to give you a figure. But in the UK, we just say, well, if it scores 4, 3, it goes in the middle there, and we put it in the box. And you can see the color coding helps us to demonstrate low, medium, high, and very high risks. So that's what we're trying to achieve. So it's the likelihood of it happening, which is separate to the impact. The impact is really quite challenging when we unpick this to do it. There is a demonstration of the, this is 3 years ago now, the National Risk Assessment in the UK. I'm using this one, I think, for an obvious process. On the left-hand side, there is the hazard, diseases, accidents, and societal risks. Range of them there. It is quite interesting when I go around the UK, I ask people, what do they think the highest risk in the UK is? Normal response is terrorism, mainly because it's in the newspapers a lot. But actually, if you think in terms of the impact of terrorism to some of these other risks, the actual impact is quite low. When you look at pandemic influenza and the number of dead and serious casualties, we're talking in the terms of potentially millions. Then you'll start to understand what the impact, what catastrophic impact is. You've got cold, snow, power failure, and various forms of flooding on the left there as the highest risks in the UK. If you look on the right, the malicious, the impact, it ranges there of different types of terrorism, including a cyber attacks. The cyber attacks on infrastructure, significant. The impact has gone up a little bit, but this was, as I say, 3 years ago. But if you notice the CBR there, a CBRN, which is the chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear attack, things like Salisbury are in that top 2 on likelihood, but 5 on impact. And if I just go back a slide, it is the reason for that red box by itself at 2.5, and that's a very high risk. So that's what we're trying to do. Now, this is a national one. Across the UK, there are local ones. I know a lot of countries around the world have a similar process. If you're doing a local one, there might be specifics in your area, specific rivers perhaps. Certainly some countries, you've got volcanoes and earthquakes, that type of risk. But the process is the same. So you're looking at the likelihood of it happening and look at the impact. Now, when we think in terms of impact, the factors you take into consideration are quite important. They're always the humanitarian or the people issues first. Fatalities, casualties, disruption to communities. That's the priority. Then it's things like the critical national infrastructure, essential services, infrastructure, roads, rail, network, all sorts of things. And then it's building up a picture to say, what is really going to impact? And actually, if you do it well, you're developing some really useful material for exercises, especially local exercises for local agencies. So that's one of the benefits of this process. But if we just go back to our incidents, the low impact, low likelihood on the bottom left-hand corner there, standard operating procedures, it's business as usual type of stuff. And even the bottom right-hand side where high impact, high likelihood and low impact, the routine shouldn't really stretch us too much, maybe a major incident, but the major incidents should really be in that sort of center area. And we should know what they are. We should know what they are, as we should the top right-hand ones. Now, I've put crisis exclamation mark. Now, the reason I put the exclamation mark is if we don't take steps to understand the incident, or we deal with it badly through not understanding the wider consequences, there's a crisis waiting to happen. A lot of people would argue that the low likelihood, i.e. we don't really think it's going to happen, high impact events are the ones that should, are likely to trouble us. But if I just go back, a lot of people suggested that Covid-19 was a crisis. Not too dissimilar to the preparations for pandemic influenza. As I said, under-resourced over the last 5-6 years. The plan was there. Could it have been adapted to meet the new circumstances, the variations? So that's something for you to think about. Now, if your risk appears on here and it's in the red area, we've got to have a plan. I'm sure you would agree, because we know about it. We've got to have a plan. And that's where really it's this, if you like, what should we do about it? So we look at our risks. What are the problems? What are we going to do about it? That's where this process really comes into its own. Develop a plan or a generic way of operating, if you like, a generic plan. So we've got the basic principles that we put around our incident in order to manage it. And really, that leads us quite nicely on to if it does happen, what are we going to do? We know, because we've got a plan, we've exercised and trained that plan, it should be quite straightforward. I'll just emphasize again, we've done the risk assessment. We know what the risks are, what the problems are likely to be. We should be developing our controls to actually prevent it from happening, preferably. I'll come back to that in a second. And then what are we going to do if it goes wrong? Open up the plan. We should have a good idea of what it is. And the last two can both be proactive and reactive. Now, when I say proactive, preventative. It is, I'm sure you would agree, far, far cheaper, less expensive, if you like, and less demanding to prevent an incident from happening. But of course, we've always got to be able to respond and be reactive as well. Just one of the, I've sort of taken this from an American document, actually. The purpose of the risk assessment is to identify all potential threats. Now, at base level, that makes sense, but actually it's wrong. If you just think about it, it's wrong. It's almost impossible to identify all potential threats because we're, if you like, limited in our thinking. So it's the language that I would always emphasize is potential threats. Identify the potential threats, because we're bound by our reasonable worst case scenario. I'll come back to that in a second. What I'm trying to emphasize is the need to develop that capability, the ability to do something about all these things. And there's a whole range of issues, and some of them have been, we've talked about or mentioned a few of them. Organizational governance, the leadership, situational awareness, information management. All these things are part of that. What are we going to do? We know what the problems are. What are we going to do if it happens? There's the last point down the bottom, 20 years to build a reputation, 5 minutes to ruin it. So it's just sort of reflecting on what it is we're trying to do, because we really want to protect organizations, but that's big and small, from the impacts of adverse events. We definitely want to protect the people, aid the recovery, support business continuity, limit the damage to reputations. again, from the looking at 9/11, if you were the security manager at the World Trade Center the day before it happened, and you asked the security manager and his team to name 100 things that could go wrong, do you think they'd have identified 2 planes flying into their building and then knocking them down? I would suggest not. I would suggest that they would have had a whole range of issues, but that it wouldn't have included 2 planes flying in. But perhaps now you would think about that. Perhaps now we would. And really, when we start talking about our contingency planning, the objectives are quite straightforward. The objective one is you're in that response phase, we're actually doing something, reacting. And initially, we're not in any form of control because it's chaotic, it's difficult. So our first objective is very much about regaining control, gaining control of the situation. And that, if you think in terms of an incident, you're turning up, it's chaos, it's difficult, the emergency services should be well drilled at putting in their cordons, evacuating people. And really, this is where the JESIP principles, the Joint Emergency Services Interoperability Principles, those operational tactical parameters should help them to regain control of the situation. That's very much what it was designed to do, regain control. And then secondly, once you've got control, it's about how we're going to return, if you like, to normal, the normal operational status. How are we going to get back to normal as speedily and effectively as possible? So that's really what they're thinking about. And often I explain this, that if you think of what is this return to normal, if you can actually get back there, if you've got roadworks and you put a diversion in, that we haven't got back to normal until those roadworks are lifted and the roads reopen. So it's back to normal, as if the event hadn't occurred in the first place. But really, when you have a serious incident, something big, returning to normal, as we're seeing with COVID and a number of other incidents, it's this term new normal or a new way of operating. So, whilst our objectives are quite simple when we're doing the contingency planning bit, our plan is to gain control of the situation. Well, there's a number of issues there, but then return to normal operational status. That's really what the fundamental principles of this contingency planning are. It's easier said than done when you start to get into some of our significant major incidents or even crises. But once you understand that process, in my view, you can manage and build plans, and gives you a framework for being involved in a huge range of incidents. From a small localized incident all the way through to the Olympic Games, or as it says there, managing the critical national infrastructure. Because that is a sort of understand the problems, what are we likely to face, what problems could come up, what are we going to do about it? So it's developing our plan, and if it goes wrong, how are we prepared? And it always, at this stage, it's worth just reflecting on your own organisation from an incident management perspective. Are you and your organisation prepared? I mentioned the are you and your organisation because we've got roles within our organisation. There is an expectation that we are individually as well as organisationally prepared. I've mentioned that it says a few things to remember. Apologise for there's a lot of writing on that slide, but there's no such thing as a random event. You might like to disagree. There's a lot of academic work around this. No such thing as a random event. If you look halfway down the screen there, you often hear, oh, it suddenly happened. Well, it's more likely you're saying, I didn't notice it happening. or your organization, there was a fault, no one actually did anything about it, or vulnerability. It's something was there and we've done nothing about it. And this is that anticipating things. This is where the planner has no right to be wrong, because it is their job to sort of keep anticipating, quite looking at what's happening locally. What are the issues? What's changing? The environment's changing. Sea levels are rising. We're getting more extremes of weather. So we must be prepared. Those 1 in 100-year floods are now, dare I say, it went down to 1 in every 10 years. I think we're now into a 1 every 5 years. Significant floods somewhere in the UK. But you can't say, I didn't notice it happening. It didn't happen suddenly. Something will trigger it. The information is there. It's a matter of recognizing it. Which brings me on to one of the points I always make to commanders, really. The earlier you are aware of a potential problem, that's the anticipating it. It's the team, perhaps saying, we need to look at this. Have we thought about that? It gives you more options to deal with it. It's a lower level of response. It doesn't cost so much, and the safer you and your communities are. So just reflect on that. If you reverse it, the longer you're unaware, or you were aware and did nothing about it, you have less options to deal with it. You need a higher level of response, and you or your communities are in greater danger. You can reflect on if you've got a difficult member of staff, the longer you leave it, the worse it gets. And it gets harder and harder to deal with it as time goes on. And often, it's just worth reflecting on this. The earlier you are aware of a problem, it gives you far more options to deal with it. And when you're looking at crisis management in all sorts of forms, the information is there. We've got to be able to spot it, and that is often the biggest challenge. Having systems and processes in place to spot potential problems. Having some people that are prepared to challenge and say, have we thought about this? Have we seen this? I'll leave that there for you to think about. And the word responsibility was mentioned by the speaker in the last session. Responsibility. What do we take responsibility for? We cannot affect the motivation of the bad guy, the technical failure, the external event, or whatever it might be, but we can do something about the opportunity. And really, it's the point I've been making. You can't take responsibility for the flood, the earthquake, the power failure, but we can think about it in advance, understand the threats and what they mean in order to minimize the likelihood of such an event occurring. This is our prevention, minimizing the likelihood or minimizing the impact of such an event. That's where, for me, this risk assessment process is so powerful, because it gives us the opportunity to minimize, first of all, minimize the likelihood, but if it does happen, minimize the impact of that event, because we thought about it in advance. We're planned, we're prepared. And when we talk about the preparing, this is our training and our exercising individually, or individual organizations coming together. And yes, there is a challenge there, because it takes time, it takes effort, and it takes finances, and it often takes people away from their day's duty. But you can't get away from the fact that the more time and effort you put into preparation, the better your response will be to an incident, or perhaps even spotting the opportunity to minimize the likelihood. Again, I'm happy to debate that afterwards, but I don't think you can get away from that. Just going back to our academics, just to see what they have to say. as a lovely sort of statement there. The truth is that when a crisis management operations fail, it is rarely because the scale or nature of the triggering event was so great that there was simply nothing could be done. It's more likely that the cause of the failures are systematic vulnerabilities are embedded in the organisation and have been known and ignored for extended periods. So what that top quote reflects very much on the floodings caused by Hurricane Katrina in the US. If you think of the US's response to that, it was appalling. No two ways about it. You know, people were stranded. They sent the military in. The military arrived. I mean, I could go on. The military arrived to a combat, or in what they thought was a combat situation, because it was the way they were briefed. Reputations were severely damaged, but it was not being prepared. The nature and the scale of the event was known in advance. It should have been prepared. The levees fail, all sorts of things happen, and the response was woeful. And that's in a very advanced country. And it also says that, you know, from an academic paper there, most man-made disasters and violent conflicts are preceded by an incubation period during which policymakers misinterpret or ignorant of or flat out ignore repeated indicators of impending danger. Covid-19? I'll leave you to think about that one. I think that's a really useful quote. I think that speaks for itself. That's a global comparison. I know statistics can show all sorts of things. It's notable there that South Korea, in fact, it's very true of a number of Far East countries, that because they'd had challenges with SARS and to a degree MERS or similar viruses, shall I say, about 5 years ago, they were far better prepared and resourced to respond to COVID. The Western countries, if you like, European and then the United States, were not very well prepared. Could we, I'm talking from a UK perspective, should we have been better prepared, having seen what was going on in predominantly Italy, believing that it wouldn't get to the UK because of all sorts of reasons? You know, should we have done better? I think the answer can always be yes. Should we have been better prepared? Yes. Could we have reduced deaths? I think the answer is also yes. But it does mean investment. It means a lot of things, and it means having people around you that are prepared to challenge you. You know, we've talked about that top, the left-hand slide there. We talked about the pandemic influenza. So the warning signs were there, and I'll just say to you, pandemic influenza is far worse than what we're currently seeing, or reasonable worst case scenario is far worse than what we're currently seeing with COVID-19. You could have as much as 20% of the UK population as fatalities. What a lovely cheery point to stop. Now, there's been a few things typed up. Karen, if you want to read them out, because I saw a few coming through. Let down by, yeah. I mean,
so Javier makes.
Yeah, go on.
Sorry. So Javier makes the point that we are living in the risk society. We have global risks, and we must coexist with them. They are reflections of progress. It's not possible to eliminate them in this 21st century. Do you want to comment on
I think if it's more a case of understanding them, and global. If you're looking from a global perspective, understanding what those threats are. I don't think we can't do. There are things we can always do about them, and that might be preparing organisations, states, continents for the impact of them. We know volcanoes will erupt. We just don't know. Well, that's not true. I was about to say we don't know when, but the science is improving. They can give an indication of the risk has gone up of an explosion. Global warming. We can see what's happening, but we've got to be prepared to think about it. We may have to live with COVID-19. It may well become endemic in our populations, i.e., there is no vaccine. We may have to think about changing, and that's that level of honesty with communities. I sincerely hope they manage to get a vaccine, but there's no guarantees. We haven't got a vaccine for flu that is effective, because it varies every year or every few years. So I don't necessarily, I understand the point, but it's about being prepared. What's the likelihood? Can we impact on the likelihood? Can we impact on the impacts? Can we do something about the impacts before they get to us? So I would suggest that there is always something we can do, and I would like to see more on, when we talk globally, more global leadership support as well for things like United Nations risk disaster management, United Nations full stop. If we all work together, we'll be in a much stronger position. You might like to come back.
Sorry. Yeah. Well, there's a few points, so I'll move on to the next one just so we can get everything in. Paul from the Academy of Cambodia makes a good point. How much and what's the responsibility of private sector and or public sector?
Yeah, it's a very good
management. How does that relationship look?
I think you've got to remember, if you just sort of take they can't do it separately. They've got to be able to work together, and when you talk in terms of the business community and sort of, if you like, government, whether it's national or locally or regionally, either of them can't work separately. They've got to work together. And that working together should start before we have an incident. It should be in that preparedness state. For me, if I'm in business, if I'm a reasonably large business, what are the things that could impact on me? What are those risks? Can I go to my local government and get a good picture of them? What advice do they give me? If I live near a river, what's the likelihood of it flooding? If it's high, what can we do about it as an organisation to keep running? And then it sort of goes up to the bigger issues about the bigger the organisations. It's about their supply lines, and I think a lot of organisations are questioning now the long distance supply lines. We all talk in terms of a just-in-time economy. So I think that relationship needs to be close, where they can offer advice and guidance to each other, but it should be a two-way flow. Certainly in the UK, businesses are involved. There's a link to local government. We'd like to think they're engaged. The honest answer would be it's the small businesses that suffer the most. Does that sort of answer the question or give a view?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Couple of other points that are linked. So, going back to crisis management and incident management, make the point that often where there are plans in place, in the moment to react, people don't use the plans that they've actually planned, and then if they do use the plans, that they have in place, then when they go to check them, they're so complicated and over comprehensive that they can't really practically use them anyway. And that was followed up by Johnny, who said that the security manager of the tower blocks in 9/11 had actually done lots of evacuation planning.
He's absolutely right.
And had he not, and we all know how difficult it is to get people to do a fire drill practice as a practice, had he not, many more lives would have been lost in the event of that unpredictable disaster.
Yes, absolutely. He was a hero. Unfortunately, he died in that evacuation, and he went to his board and said, "We are going to need to do a monthly fire drill." If you imagine being told you're going to do a monthly fire drill, most of us have either taken part or seen them happening. People say, "Oh, yeah, okay, we'll come outside, we'll all have a chat, and we'll go back in again." But absolutely right, because they had done that drill, they evacuated, I've forgotten the name of the company, but they evacuated a large number of their staff, and I think it was only him and a few others, because he went back into the towers to rescue what he thought was the outstanding people, and very few of the staff from that premises died. But yeah, I mean, it's I think our challenge is it's helping people understand the risk environment, and why we're doing things. And I think training and exercising is really important, but of course it's time consuming. And when we've got priorities to do various things, finding the time to do some training and exercising, single agency as well as multi-agency, is often a challenge. I think I've forgotten the first part of the question, Karen. What was the first part of the question?
It was just about the fact that when we do have plans, we forget to use them, or right. When we do.
Yeah. Got it. I think, I'm a firm believer in having, especially for the initial phase, having a generic approach to incidents. For most incidents, whether they're just a standard incident or a major incident, we just get the generic stuff done, and then it is almost a time for reflection. So, but you're absolutely right. The bigger the plan, less likelihood of people are going to read it. But if the generic principles are always the same, to allow people to just put things in place, if you think in terms of policing, it's the cordons, it's about evacuation, it's about identifying an RVP, getting together the other agencies, protecting the public, evacuation, rescue. All those things are quite generic depending on the incident, which is where the UK GESIP principles are quite good at helping you do that. But it's at this stage, okay, we've got this, and as I'll take you through tomorrow, it's what has happened, what is happening now, what are we doing about it? Is the sort of can be the easy stuff. Then it's the so what are the wider impacts and consequences of this? And this is where I tend to always fall back to processes. What do we understand the situation? What are we trying to achieve, our direction, and what actions come out of that? Now, that can be simplified down to quite an easy plan for people to remember. And if they always do that in training, they always do it at exercising, it becomes embedded in their thinking, and it helps us to deliver the plan in those initial stages before our planner turns up and says, now here's the plan, have we done X, Y, and Z? If it's generic, the answer is usually yes, but if it's specific, you sometimes need those planners to be alongside you. But I do understand the problem. I've seen plans that are about an inch thick, and you go, lots of detail in there, but you probably need the person that's written the plan alongside you as your advisor to tell you the bits you need. And then you just say, yes, go do it. Any others, Karen?
Roger, that's brilliant. Thank you ever so much. Well, there is, but it's 10:30.
Oh, yes.
So we've run out of time. There's a really good question from Rod about how do we basically prepare our leaders around planning so that we're looking forward and we're not engaging in a blame game, that we're making it better for all. But I think if we can maybe pick that up at the start of Wednesday's session, that would be good.
Well, actually, it's something that I'll try to cover in Wednesday's session, because so when we talk about our leaders, it's a failure of thinking, and I'll leave it there. But what I would just encourage people to do is spend 10 minutes online if you can. Have a look at your local, regional, or national risk assessment or risk register. This should be most countries, certainly across the UK, it's relatively easy to find. Reflect on the risks that are in there or what could go wrong, and just ask yourself, is your organisation, are you prepared for these things? Because there's a lot of information out there. It's often not used, not viewed, not understood, which is I'll carry that on tomorrow. So back to you, Karen. Same time tomorrow.
Okay, Wednesday.
Oh, sorry,
okay,
same
that's
time
brilliant. So,
Wednesday.
Roger, thanks ever so much. That was really good. I'll just collate any extra questions and I'll send them to you to address before we get going.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you everybody who's taken part in this session for the chat. It's been really interesting and at times hard to keep up with. It's been so good. I hope you're all going to be fresh and ready to go Wednesday morning at 9 for the second session in this workshop. And just one thing for me, if anybody's got any comments or feedback about how today's gone, because this is the first one, just drop me a line. I really would welcome your thoughts, because we obviously want to make this as good as we can for the people participating. So thank you ever so much, and see you on Wednesday morning, 9 o'clock. Bye for now. Bye.